Welcome to the IMC NMC Symposium, Protecting Free Speech in the Global Music Landscape. After two panels on historical repressions and the growing trends against free musical expression, we have now reached the third panel, Mobilizing to Protect Speech Freedoms in the 21st Century. With me here are, just as you were presented earlier, Andra Matei, Moderator, Sanjay Sethi, and Diana Ramarohetra. So, you are very welcome. You are just the persons we want on this panel because of the work that you are doing in the field that we are going to discuss today. And I would love to hear a bit more from your own words, who you are and what you actually do in this field. And maybe, Andra, you could start off and explaining a bit on what you actually do.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Alfons. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and looking very much forward to this discussion together. So I am an art and free speech lawyer working internationally and based in Paris. My core expertise relates to creating strategies to best protect artists and the creation process and make sure that the artistic intention is accurately presented in court. So I do intellectual property law, but also freedom of expression cases, and more specifically ECHR cases before the European Court of Human Rights. Now, in parallel, I run Avant-Garde Lawyers, which is an international nonprofit based in Paris, but again, working internationally. Avant-Garde Lawyers defend the rights of artists to imagine and create freely by providing specialized support to artists around the world, artists who are victims of harassment, censorship, arbitrary detention, for peacefully expressing their social and political opinions through art.
Thank you, Andra, and thank you for the great work that you are doing. Thank you. Sanjay, would you give us a few words on what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Really happy to be with the esteemed panelists on a topic that's of such great importance right now. I am the Executive Director of Artistic Freedom Initiative, and our organization directly assists artists who have experienced persecution, censorship, or other restrictions on their right to express themselves. We support artists who are also demonstrating a commitment to advancing progressive social change and fundamental human rights. Our organization started in 2017, and we have 4 core programs, which is the bulk of the time that I spend right now working on cases related to these programs. The first is immigration services to artists at risk. So these are artist visas and asylum cases for artists who are censored and persecuted. Since 2017, we worked on over 1,000 cases involving artists who are at risk. We also have a resettlement program that's headquartered in New York, and we provide housing for artists at risk. And fingers crossed, we are about to start a program in Los Angeles as well. And then finally, we have a program called Artists for Social Change, where we feature artists in exhibitions, concerts, for artists at risk. It could be in any discipline of the arts. And then my apologies, I should state our 4th program, which is Artistic Freedom Monitor, where we produce human rights reports related to domestic situations that are becoming more repressive. Recently, we produced a report on Poland and Hungary on the situation there vis-a-vis the arts and cultural sector. So that is our sort of in-country advocacy program. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And also thank you for the great work that you are doing, you and your colleagues. Thank you. Diana, would you like to, I know that you have a bit of, you might have a bit of problem with the connection. We hope that we will be able to keep you on, but Diana, please go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Diana Ramarohetra, quite difficult. I'm from Madagascar, and I'm currently in Madagascar. So all my career, I worked for the strengthening the creative industry in Africa. I work for different organizations, but the reason why I'm part of this panel is because from 2014 to 2018, I ran the project, which was Art Touch Africa, led by Artair Network. It was implemented in different countries in Africa. And at that time, we were the pioneer to work on the artistic freedom in the continent. So we provide assistance to the artists and we train artists to understand. That was our first goal, to make artists understand what are they right and how to claim it and how to work with government on that side. But then, since then, I completely moved, but I still working with different organizations where I provide support or advice for artistic freedom. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thank you for the work that you are doing and have been doing also together with the International Music Council as with the cooperation as well for a long time. Thank you. Ole, the same question to you. What is it, in your words, that you do?
Thank you very much for inviting me, Alfons. I have a background as a music journalist with the Danish Broadcasting, and I did a lot of research in Africa and Asia during the 80s and 90s and realized that music censorship was almost everywhere, but no one really addressed this. So we were a couple of people in the late 90s said, how come that musicians don't have an organization defending them and addressing the issues of censorship? You know, PEN existed for writers. So we had talks, and it ended up that we founded an organization called FreeMuse, organized the first World Conference in 1998. I worked with the organization from 2004 to 17. I was executive director up till 17, and since then I've been working on and off with UNESCO. I'm part of the so-called expert facility for the 2005 convention, specifically on artistic freedom. We've done workshops around the world, and that's basically what I do. There's sometimes consulting arts councils or whatever, whenever they want to know anything about artistic freedom.
Thank you, Ole. Thank you very much for that. And thank you also for being the one person who was probably the first one in our community, that our collective in the music community as authors, also pushing us within the music ecosystem, and not just relying on human rights organizations, but looking at the importance of music itself, safeguarding its rights and promoting them. And this is a bit of what we are going to get into now. I'd like to hear your views. That you have a title on the panel, mobilizing, but who is it that really, who is it that we need to mobilize in these issues? Maybe I could turn to you, Ole, directly. You know, this year, 2023, who is it who we need to push?
Well, there's been a big change in the past 10 years in the sense that much more, let's say, UN organizations, much more politicians are aware of the issues of repression of artistic freedom. Many more organizations have come up working in collaboration with each other and sometimes on their own. So I think the most important is still to get more artist organizations involved in addressing these issues, because we have all the legal systems. Andra can talk much more about that. They exist, we can make use of them. I'm not saying it makes a big change, but we have mechanisms of supporting artists at risk, and especially musicians when we're talking about it. But I still lack this genuine dedication from artists organizations, except for a few. One of them is, of course, SCAP, International Music Council, has also supported this for many years. But in general, we still have a situation where artists' organizations either have a blind eye or they lack capacity to do documentation, monitoring, and supporting those artists. Obviously, in many countries, we've seen that also from the environment of writers, that there are infights within the countries. They may be in the same club, like, you know, local PEN chapter, but there can be all kind of discussions of who should be in and who should be out. Unfortunately, it's not in the DNA of artists to protect their colleagues the way it is with journalists.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ole on that, because when we work at Artwatch Africa, we really struggle to get artists together to do a campaign, especially in Africa. And most of them, they working on silos. What I mean is, like, when it's a musician, hip hop musician, then maybe the hip hop in the region can work together, but the writer will never get on board, to protect, and all of them are artists. So we should mobilize the artists as a group, not as a discipline. But then more and more, I think we also need to mobilize more the international organization. I think Ole is working on that with UNESCO as well, because it's important also to remind the state that they have state obligation when they ratify different conventions, which even include the Human Rights Convention and also the 2005 Convention. So it's important to remind them they have obligation to protect the artistic freedom. And that, I think, is that part. And every time you're talking about freedom of speech, they talk about journalists, and they never take in consideration the artists. So that's also something that you need to on. And I think Ole know that better than me, even though I work in that area for several times. Yeah.
Thank you, Diana. And as much as I agree with the both of you, I just want to add also, being a composer myself and knowing that sometimes we as individuals, if not as companies or organizations, can have a bit of low self-esteem. We're not that important in the ecosystem. Sometimes we are not fairly remunerated. We don't have that. Sometimes I think it can have something to do with not thinking that you actually can make a difference. So raising that self-esteem, I think, can be important as well in making the musical and cultural community even stronger. Andra, what do you say? When you work and seeing this from a legal perspective, do you also see that there's a lack? Do you need more support from the music and cultural sphere itself?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. The way avant-garde lawyers work is that we try to put at the core of our intervention teams and of our defense strategies the artists. So I think we work the other way around. We try to empower artists. Like, you speak of confidence, we speak of empowerment, which is practically the same thing. But what we're trying to do is put the artist at the core of our work, so that we make sure that their intention and the creation process and everything that they are trying to communicate in a court of law, if they knew the law, it is heard. So this is very important for us. The way we're trying to do law here, it's not like in a law firm, but this is why it's an NGO, not a law firm, because we're trying to do it in a way where we are telling artists, musicians included, don't be afraid of the law. We're not here to restrict you, and law is not here to limit you, to tell you until where you can express yourself, what's the limit of your freedom, but it is here to reinforce your rights, to tell you what your rights are and how we can protect you. So I think there is a dynamic here between the law and the art that me personally, in my prior avant-garde lawyer's life, but also now I'm trying to balance. And we get a lot from working with artists in that way. We do get the support. I feel there is this exchange that happens, which is very, very precious to us. They tell us, you are able to put on paper what we have been trying to express for so long, and you're doing it with words. We are doing it in a non-verbal manner. And we, in return, we're very grateful for their trust in us, for them expressing themselves and telling us, this is what I try to do with this performance, with this happening, with this visual art piece. So I think this is at the core of avant-garde lawyers, yes, this exchange, and it's going on well, I think.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Sanjay, both adding on to this, but also maybe staying a bit on the legal framework. Is it always connected? So in a country where you have a strong legal framework, is it automatically then, do we really have our freedom of expression? Is everything just, perfect in a country where the law actually says so?
That's a really interesting question. And to use as an example, Hungary and Poland, I think that's actually a very relevant example. I know, we had mentioned that we produced 2 reports. Hungary and Poland are parties to the European Convention on Human Rights. They've adopted a framework within their constitution that protects freedom of expression and artistic and cultural expression. But I think what we're finding, especially with the rise of illiberalism and certain forms of authoritarianism, is that these governments have figured out a way to facially comply with the law, but sort of surreptitiously or underhandedly restrict freedom of expression. So for example, in Poland and Hungary, if the government is defunding art that they find distasteful and funding right-wing or nationalist art, that may not violate what we would traditionally consider as the negative right to be free from the government restricting our right to express ourselves. But effectively what they're doing is they're creating an environment that guarantees that the proper ideological content comes out. So I think having this legal framework is important, certainly, but it's the job of advocacy organizations to point out when the environment in the country is restrictive and try to highlight the different ways these restrictions are happening, the sort of secretive, underhanded ways that these governments are using to restrict free expression. And you see that even in both of these countries where they take the arts institutions, and this goes from radio, television, museums, get rid of all the leadership and put ideologically aligned leaders at all of these institutions who then program exactly the way that the governments want programming to take place. Does that give the appearance of censorship in the old school form? When you had a traditional censor that could decide what should be produced? No, but the effect is still the same. So in that sense, I think it's not just good enough to have a legal framework. You need a civil society and a robust nonprofit sector that calls the government to task, and the international organizations that are keen on listening to these issues.
I'd like to add to that, because if we just think of going 20 years back, some of you will remember the Dixie Chicks were protesting against the invasion in Iraq. Now, what happened there? Because all the legal framework is in place in the US, but the pressure from civil society, the pressure from huge parts of the music industry basically put them out of business for several years. And it's a tendency that we see all over the world, that you may have all these legal systems there, but you have a lot of civil society pressure groups, whether they are politically motivated or religiously motivated. And that can be end of that. I think later we could probably come in and talk about the boycott that Andra has made a report on. But I'd also like to mention, since we're also looking what can we do, this is going to be broadcast, as I understand, on Music Freedom Day. If I may, I'll just give a brief background to Music Freedom Day, because we organized in FreeMuse a world conference in Istanbul in 2006. And of course, everyone was upset about the situation for musicians in many, many countries. And then, of course, the question came, what can we do apart from FreeMuse documenting, making advocacy, monitoring, all these kind of issues? A colleague from Canadian Broadcasting came up and said, why don't we have a day where we celebrate music freedom and get people's awareness? And most of us, including myself, said, who wants to have another day? We have the UN Day for this and that and that and that. The fact was that especially many broadcasters and some cultural organizations in the following years said, no, that's a very good idea, because then we can put this topic up and we can concentrate on that. And what happened over the years was that Music Freedom Day gradually developed as an advocacy, a presentation of artists in up to 30 countries, organized locally, because people in various countries felt this is important for us. And I think it's one of the things you can learn over the years, that the more that can be organized and addressed locally, the better. Because you can have international organizations, we can have legal situations talking about how bad it is in that country, but it has to be in the countries. What we can do internationally is to support those movements and struggles.
Thank you, Ulla. Yes, Sanjay?
Yes, and I think Ulla raised a really important point regarding non-state actors as well, which becomes very challenging even within a very progressive human rights framework. And what we're also seeing in a lot of countries, for example, in India, is you have a leader who's whipping up public sentiment, and then all of a sudden you have a very hostile environment towards a particular artist or towards a particular art form. And it would be, I think, incomplete to lay blame to countries like India and Poland and Hungary. I mean, Ulla mentioned Andra's report as well regarding the discrimination against Russian artists. It's happening in what we consider progressive countries as well. So it really cuts across political ideology. And it seems like in certain respects, it's becoming more and more acceptable. And I think this is an area I'm sure that we're going to continue to talk about in this discussion and hopefully beyond.
Absolutely. Andra, would you like to just elaborate a bit on the report now mentioned of both Ulla and Sanjay, so the audience also understands?
No, of course, I would love to do that. But before that, I feel it's important that we set a bit of background about freedom of expression and the cancel culture we are both referring at, the pressure from the civil society to boycott and to do that. We do live in a very polarized society. We keep on hearing these words today, and it is true, it is polarized, and it's difficult to defend art when artists are being cancelled so easily just because, for fear of being, cancelled themselves. Museums and cultural institutions just take the upper hand, and I think this is very dangerous, and it's a very dangerous precedent as well. But about freedom of expression, because freedom of artistic expression is an integral part of freedom of expression, of course. So it is. Just to add a legal perspective a little bit to the discussion, I feel that like freedom of expression, it is considered a fundamental right in any democratic society, and it is a very well established right in international law. But more than that, and I want to emphasize on this here, is that it is a political legal question. It is intrinsically linked to democratic processes, democratic values, to popular sovereignty, to the separation of power, to an independent judiciary. So if we cannot express discontent and criticism about violations of other rights, if we can't say that we have been discriminated against or arbitrarily detained or censored, then it is the end of our democratic societies as we know them. And this is why in authoritarian regimes, free speech is the first right to be taken away. So just, restricting freedom of expression, be it verbal or non-verbal, is symptomatic of a weak democratic system. And I think this is the message, that it's very important that we as, stakeholders in this field need to be able to communicate as much as possible. Now, with artistic freedom, there are some challenges to defending it, and to add to what Ola and Sanjay have said about these tendencies of non-state actors to get involved in democratic processes and challenge a framework, a human rights framework that is well established in a democratic country. I think one other challenge from a legal perspective and lawyers is that there is this tendency, again, in domestic laws everywhere to protect speech primarily and only secondarily expression that is non-verbal. The reason being that non-verbal expression, abstract expression, such as is involved in artistic expression, for instance, is considered to be less important than speech that has a political or social import. So the law in general affords political speech a high level of protection, and it is because political speech is considered to relate to matters of general interest, to raise issues of general concerns, issues that concerns us all, right? So these speeches, these expressions are intended to influence debate and conversation, which is essential in a democratic society. For the same reasons, journalists enjoy greater levels of protections as well, and they have their privileges under the law. Unfortunately, artists are not considered, part of this category of people contributing to our democratic societies by generating debate and conversation, etc. And this is, from a legal perspective, this is very difficult to defend and very difficult to argue. This is why at Avant-Garde Lawyers, we had cases where we argued that artistic expression, no matter its form, it can be a political or social commentary and should enjoy the same levels of protection that speech has. This is what we call strategic litigation, and if we have time, I'll get more into how we do this work, but I just wanted to highlight this big challenge that we as lawyers have when one is trying to defend artistic freedom. In this, what you all call ideal human rights context, I think it is far from being ideal even in our own societies.
Thank you, Andra, for elaborating on that. I just first, Sanjay, please go ahead first.
Yes, and I certainly don't intend for the lawyers to hijack the conversation. I think developing on one of Andra's points too, and relating back, Alfons, to the first question, one of the challenges right now is actually when we advocate before governments to get involved in a particular human rights situation involving artistic freedom, is getting them to understand the link between democracy and artistic freedom. It's not always immediately apparent. They don't look at artistic freedom within the context of civil society and democratization as much in trying to intervene in repressive countries vis-a-vis our arts and cultural policy. So that's something that we've definitely seen as a challenge. I know there are positive developments. I think the European Parliament's recent announcement for a new EU cultural policy maybe is a start or a step in the right direction. But I think that's something that we're seeing on an individual advocacy standpoint that has been a bit of a challenge for us.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you. Let me just add one thing to this conversation. We're talking about freedom of speech, that you have the freedom to say what you want or create what you want. But that's not really enough, is it? You actually have the right to reach someone with what you actually do, with your artistic expression, the right of citizens to have access to these works. And seeing how things have changed, I'm thinking about the framework that you put out, Ule, and we're now in a much more digital framework in one sense when it comes to musical distribution, etc. There we have other kinds of gatekeepers maybe than just politics or states. We have a market also deciding on what to reach out with. And Diana, I'd like to ask you, you having been working in so many of the African countries and now seeing that in some musical areas, we have musical expressions from parts of Africa that totally just takes over the world. And I'm saying that in a very good sense. But I guess that also there's very many limitations as to who actually gets to reach out and which windows of opportunity there are. And also, I'm sure you have seen difficulties in that if you are not complying to either the market or what the policies of a nation is recommending, so to say. Diana, what are your views from your regional perspectives there?
Yeah, so yes, of course, in Africa, now we have a famous artist like on the Billboard and Music Award everywhere. The Afrobeat is like winning the game at the moment. But yeah, there is a lot of how to say, the marketing, the economic issue. A lot of game is like people can pay the artist to put their name on the song. Or that's also why during election, politicians pay artists to promote their program, and so the politicians are really at this stage, during the election, they know how to work with the artists and use their freedom of expression just to promote their campaign. But then afterwards, they can change their mind, and it's always difficult. And coming again with the question of the solidarity between the artists, because a lot of artists are playing this economic game with politicians, with operator, and so on, and they don't want to lose that market. So when artists, like in Cameroon, for instance, we had an artist who was in jail for a while, and a lot of artists didn't want to step up because they don't want to lose the money that they get from the operator, from the the equivalent of Bouygues Telecom in Paris or things like that, because they get a lot of money from there, and they don't want to support the artist. And then the other things, coming back with the legal things that you are talking. Sorry, I was out of the connection at some point. What we also see in 2014 at that time is like, and I'm happy now that we have people like Andra who are working like a lawyer, because at that time, and especially in Africa, we really struggled to get lawyer on board. Like really, it was difficult for us to reach. And even we tried to advocate and lobby with the human rights organization, and it was exhausting. Because they don't see, they don't see the interest and the importance of the artist, and sometimes even something that, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the English word, like they deserve it. Yeah, they deserve the punishment. They deserve to be beaten by the police because their songs are bad, or they're doing wrong things to the religious. And that's also very tricky for us at that moment. So it's good if you have more lawyers on board, even though in some country, the fact that we do not have any legal framework was a good point, because you can do everything and you can, overpass it. So it really depends on the context. But yeah, the economic issue was for us very difficult, because, as I say, artists need to pay their bill, and politicians, like, they pay a lot and they keep quiet. So it's a self-censorship, and somehow, yeah.
Mm. I think also there's a generation thing here. I may be wrong, but Africa used to produce a number of really great artists who were also very politically active and played a very significant role. Gianna was just talking about Cameroon. One of the great artists there, Lapiro de Mabanga, was in prison for 3 years. He was often called the sheriff of the backyards. And the role that Lapiro and many of the rappers in Senegal, before that also many of the musicians in South Africa, played was that they politicized a whole generation of young people when they talked about corruption, when they talked about power politics, when they talked about the importance of being part of elections. They generated a lot of political activities, which of course the people in power did not like. There are a few examples today, but the industry also, as we know, changes all the time. So I mean, those of us who are old enough to remember the late 1960s and the wave of political artists in the West as well, especially protesting the Vietnam War, I think this goes in cycles. And we may be coming into this cycle again with the war on Ukraine. Of course, those who are directly affected, or in the neighboring countries like Belarus, where the artists play a very strong role in politicizing young people, should not be forgotten. But there is the risk also then that artists are then just seen as politicians and not as artists. And I think it's always a very difficult balance for the artists, because organizations working on human rights would also want to put artists into a certain wardrobe. You know, now you are a human rights defender. Yes, in principle, you are a human rights defender if you stand up for your rights, but maybe you don't want to see yourself as that. You want to see yourself as an artist. It goes back to all the stereotypes of how we talk about artists when we talk about African artists. Well, African artists are artists, basically, and then they may come from Africa. But it's the way we talk about things. So that's also important, how we address issues. And of course, we can go through many topics here today. But I think the balance also with how regimes are making use of arts and music as part of their policies, and how musicians, composers have to deal with it. Everyone knows after the football championship that we were talking about sports washing. We still don't talk a lot about arts washing, and many countries, Morocco, for years have been arts washing in the sense that they make fantastic festivals. At the same time, musicians and artists are repressed in the country. Saudi Arabia is now launching huge programs for the arts. And at the same time, we know that they are also violating many rights. And how do you as an artist deal with this? When you get these invitations, you get proper pay or even better pay. Or you may do like Rod Stewart said, no, I'm not going to go there and sing. This is a very strong political statement. Others would say, no, it's good. We have dialogue and whatnot. So you also put a lot of pressure on the artists that they have to relate to this and this and this. And many organizations say, oh, we would like you to do this and this for us.
Thank you, Ulla. And to make this even more complex, and Sanjay, I can start with you there. But when we now talk about the importance of pushing, taking a stand, and really trying to mobilize, which is, what this panel partly is about, is there something that we need to be careful of? The risks involved also in mobilizing, if you don't really know what you're doing, just going, following your feeling and shedding light on a special cause or even individuals. So when we talk about mobilize, how do we make sure that it's being done in the right way, so to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult process, because I think we live in such a highly politicized world that when you mobilize, if we mobilize a group of people in favor of artistic expression, but it means something specific to them, and there's a particular political viewpoint attached to artistic freedom, then you are inadvertently advocating for their particular political agenda. And I think we're seeing this play out throughout the world right now, because what these rights mean, it can mean something subjectively to someone. And advocacy today, it has to be very well measured. So I think just because of the intertwining of arts and politics or artistic freedom and the political process, it could be very, very tricky.
Andra, do you want to add something to that also, in obviously wanting to get support, but also at times necessary to keep a low profile? So how can we, ask everyone to mobilize when maybe that's not the best tactical thing to do?
I think this is a difficult question to answer because every case is different. So we at Avant-Garde lawyers and in general, I think we need to look at the particular circumstances, really, of each situation and each case. It happens. We had cases in the past from the same country, you know, where we had to employ different strategies to defend the artists. Even artists arrested at the same time for the same reason. For one of them, we decided that, you know, making a bit of noise and having advocacy that it's public and going to UN mechanisms and regional instruments or regional courts was better than, you know, in other situations that look identical but are not identical, where we decide not to say anything because maybe, I mean, in this particular case, the artist was imprisoned. And, you know, when you are under, you know, state custody, then we don't want to jeopardize your security. So what is most important for us as lawyers is the security of the people we are trying to protect. And no, this comes first, no matter what. So yeah, I would say it really depends on the case. The way we do advocacy as lawyers, I guess it's different from how other civil societies do it. We do as what we call is a strategic litigation. We try to pick up a case where, you know, the impact is not only at the individual level, but has a societal impact. The way we judge art in a court of law has a great impact on how society perceives art, you know, society as a whole. So we want to make sure that at that level, you know, judges say the right things about art. And it is through that individual case that we're trying to make things happen.
When we started in 98 at Freemuse and started lobbying with organizations and donors and whatnot, and talked about music censorship, they would always reply, "What censorship?" There was simply no awareness. So I think to make strategies on mobilization, the first thing is we need to know what is the problems. The documentation is the core. And that documentation is still lacking. In those more than 20 years that Freemuse has existed, we never got over more than 85 countries of documentation. The rest is blank. You simply don't get the facts. I remember also when Diana and the Arts Watch network started, they did a great job to try to find out what's the problem in various countries. But one of the problems was, how do you follow up on that? Because it always comes down to resources. So one thing is that you may create a network like Arterial or other networks, but unless you can fund individuals who can work full-time on documentation, then you don't know what the real problem is. So that's one issue. The other issue is, how do we deal with those people who are repressing these issues? I mean, shall we invite them into the room? Shall we invite ourselves into the room and discuss this? I think there's a lack of bravery in the educational systems, not only in school systems, but also in the arts institutions. I've discussed with many arts institutions, why don't you have, you know, at least one day dealing with artistic freedom? Because eventually, whether you're a visual artist or musician, you may get into trouble and then you don't know where to go. In most cases, I think it goes with Andra's organization and Santia's as well. They would come to you when they have a problem, not before, because they're not aware that they might get into a problem. I'll give one example. In 2006, we did a conference in the Middle East in Beirut, and we invited Islamic scholars, because as we know, just look at Afghanistan, you have some people there who believe that music is not allowed according to Islam, which is, sorry the expression, absolute bullshit. So you need to involve people who are scholars, who know the arguments. Now, one of the scholars who came into that conference had specifically studied the Quran and all the readings, you know. And he said that 80% of the arguments being used against music are false. So then you can go down to, let's say, the 20% were quite similar to what some Christian fundamentalists believe. And then you can start the argument, why is it that you as a civil society group or a religious group or whatever wants to ban this particular expression and try to create a dialogue? I'm not saying it's working, but unless we confront people directly with their own arguments, we will only then refer to legal aspects, because the whole social, religious, political, whatever idea people have is on their mindset, and that's deciding on how they feel they have the right to repress others.
Great. So just to follow up on two things, I think one of the things to think about is how you mobilize, in what manner you mobilize. So, for example, in the report on Poland and Hungary, interestingly enough, all of the artists we interviewed in Hungary chose to remain anonymous. All the artists in the Poland report did not remain anonymous, but I think in both countries you have a sort of similar circumstance in how this advocacy gets responded to. You're trying to build public support, certainly abroad and certainly to international institutions and even funding organizations. But you also have to think domestically in some ways. Producing these reports and advocating, if you don't do it the right way, can actually play into those regimes' hands. So for example, in Poland and Hungary, one of the big narratives are elites from Western European countries or the United States imposing their cultural values domestically. So all of a sudden, if you sell yourself as a mouthpiece for artistic freedom within those countries, then you actually may be advancing their narrative in a way, which is why it's important to think about who to partner with domestically and how to try to figure out different ways to empower local groups to, build a grassroots advocacy that has the potential to, gain momentum. And then in another important point that Andra touched upon earlier, artist safety is also tremendously important. One of the examples was we started a program in March in Germany in evacuating and resettling artists there, many of whom are actually musicians. And we're building a public campaign around the events. And there are many other organizations that come to us. They're like, oh, can we host an event featuring X, Y, and Z artists? But it's very difficult because many of them have family back home. And you also are working on cases for artists that are still in Afghanistan. And similar cases, you may be doing some damage in similar cases as well. So very, very delicate. Public advocacy is in this space. Security is obviously something that has to measure into what you do.
Thank you, Sanjay. Andra, you want to continue on that?
Yes, there's so much I want to say. I think Sanjay, but also Ole have said things that maybe I just start with Ole's documentation part. He mentioned how difficult documentation it is and how resources are necessary, but I also think there's a big challenge with documenting artistic freedom cases that comes from the fact that charges against these artists are almost never connected to the real reason why they are imprisoned. We all know the usual suspects, insulting the king, joining a terrorist group, state security matters and corruption charges, all of that. So it is very difficult not only to identify cases that touch on artistic freedom, because these artists can be artists that are unknown. These are artists that are not famous, because if they were famous, maybe they would not be imprisoned or such an easy target for the governments. So it's very difficult to identify the cases that touch on artistic freedom and very difficult to monitor them. So it's a huge challenge. And I think FreeMuse has been doing an incredible job by working with the local communities to be able to monitor that and to get information out of these countries. At Avant-Garde Lawyers, we have this big challenge as well, and we work with local lawyers, local experts, translators, interprets nonstop. Sometimes we do things that are not. We need to be very creative about how we do this work in order to get the right information. So that's one point on the documentation. It's a big deal. It's not like, when you have journalists in prison for the work they do, it's so obvious why they are so, because they wrote that report, they denounced that act of corruption, they've done that. So it's so much more easy. So we all of us here, we have a very difficult task.
I would love to just continue this discussion for at least another hour. We are going to move on a bit now because we are reaching the end of the session. I'd like to hear, Diana, since we have you on board now. I'm sorry that you have difficulties with the connections, but I really would love to hear, something that you, as a last thought, that you want to leave with the audience. If we could get that from all of you, that would be great. And Diana, if we could start with you, what would you like to send to our audience now as your last thought on this panel?
My last thought will be for the artists, like, don't underestimate your work, and please keep in touch with people to know what is your right, how to defend it. And that's why I'm saying don't underestimate, because I think a lot of artists doesn't understand that. And you need also to work more together. That will be my last word for stakeholder, especially for the, how do you say, the state government. I think I hope that we'll do much better to advocate with them and to support them, because also sometimes even them, when they come in power, they don't know what to do. So if we explain to them the good point that they will get by defending the artist, maybe they will come from our side and will help us to get a better legal framework and to protect also the artist, when they will understand what's the added value for the democracy and also for the society, what artists can bring. Very
good. Thank you very much, Diana. Sanjay, your final thoughts to leave with the audience?
Yeah, just picking up on what Andra said on the difficulties quantifying restrictions on artistic expression. Self-censorship is a phenomenon that's very, very difficult to measure. And there's just one vignette in particular that I recall that relates to this. I was on a panel with a Polish playwright, and we were focusing on Poland's blasphemy laws. And the effect of the blasphemy law, we had detailed how many times it's been used, but its effect is very profound. And you can't measure how many times an artist changed their lyrics. But there was one vignette that is humorous in a dark way, but she was staging a play that involved the Catholic Church and matters of controversy involving the Catholic Church. And they hired a lawyer to be present during all the rehearsals to note what violated the blasphemy statute in Poland. And the lawyer would chime in that, like, oh, you may not want to do that. There was a scene of two priests kissing each other, and they actually had to curate that scene in a way to make sure that they didn't get charged. Now, was that quantifiable as a case of censorship or restrictive expression or restriction on expression? It didn't make it into our report because we weren't aware of it at the time. But if you think on a micro level, how many times that's happening day to day because of something like that, there are things that we can't measure, which is why qualitative approaches have to play in as well. But it's certainly a challenge.
Thank you for that, Sanjay. Thank you. Andra?
Yes, I would say that freedom of expression must not be taken for granted, that it is vigilance on the part of all of us that can help maintain, protect, and defend it. And I would encourage all of you and all of us not to be afraid to push the envelope in our common mission to ensure that artists have the freedom to imagine and create freely.
Thank you very much for that. Ule.
There's a Arabic proverb. It says, all that is banned is desired. And I think whatever they ban are people who always want to have part of that. And another quote I'd like to add is from a musician who said, you can kill the musician, but you cannot kill the song. And a final quote, which is a song by Jimmy Cliff, action speaks louder than words.
Thank you very much for that, Ule. And I have a last one as well. And this was actually, Ule, we were together in the UN Assembly after having worked on the report on artistic freedom. And after a long discussion, one of the representatives from one of the countries just found a solution and just said to us all, isn't it enough for you musicians and artists just to entertain? Well, the answer is no. And with that, we'll end this session. And thank you so much for the crucial work that you are doing and for taking part in this panel. And I'm sure that we will work even closer together when we move on into a future with, I wouldn't say where freedom of expression is never threatened. It will be, but we will stay vigilant and work together even closer. Thank you very much for joining us.